Imagine standing before a judge. The judge looks at you and asks,
"How old are you?"
and you don't know. Not because your memory is failing, and not because you're hiding something, simply because nobody ever wrote it down. In some countries, people were legally required to invent an age, not estimate, invent. And if two witnesses confirmed that you were roughly 30 years old, that became your official age, forever, even if you were 44 or 23. This was not an exception. In the Roman army, the minimum age for military service was around 17, but there were no birth certificates to prove it, no papers, no records, nothing a young man could hand to an officer at the gate. So when he showed up,
"I am ready to fight. Please take me."
the soldiers looked at him.
"Too young."
They looked at your jaw, your beard, the width of your shoulders. If you seemed too young, you were sent away. Not because anyone could prove your age, simply because you did not look old enough. It sounds almost too simple, but this was how armies were assembled, how courts made judgments, how taxes were assessed. The body was the only document that existed, and depending on what that document seemed to say, doors were either closed in front of you or opened far too soon. This was the standard for hundreds of millions of people across thousands of years, and it shaped history in ways we can barely imagine today. And most of us take it completely for granted. We know how old we are. There is a date of birth somewhere, in a passport, on a driver's license, in a digital system on a server in some cooled hall far away. It feels permanent, like a fact of nature. But that system is not old. Quite the opposite. Universal birth registration, the practice of officially recording every birth, has only existed in most countries since the 19th or early 20th century. In large parts of the world, it only became standard after the Second World War. This means that the vast majority of all people who have ever lived on this earth had no precise idea of how old they were. They lived, they worked, they married and fought and died. They built cathedrals and empires, wrote laws and philosophy, raised children and buried parents. But the exact date on which they themselves were born was simply not recorded anywhere. And yet society functioned. Wars were fought, taxes were paid, people stood before judges and inherited land and raised families. The question of how that was possible, how entire civilizations operated without this most basic piece of personal information, is what this story is about. The world without a calendar. The earliest civilizations we know of, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, had sophisticated calendars. They tracked the movements of stars, counted the phases of the moon, and knew with precision when the Nile would flood and when it was time to plant. But those calendars belonged to the cosmos, to the gods, to the rhythms of agriculture. They were not personal documents. They did not record the day you arrived in the world. For most of human history, the idea of a birthday as something worth marking simply did not exist. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's birthday was celebrated because he was considered divine, a cosmic event worth noting in the royal records. For ordinary people, there was nothing to celebrate and nothing to record. The day of your birth passed like any other day, and the years that followed were counted, if they were counted at all, by the seasons that came and went, rather than by any formal system of personal reckoning. In ancient Greece, a birthday was sometimes acknowledged, though rarely as a personal occasion in the way we understand it today. The practice was connected more to communal ritual than to individual identity, a way of marking the passage of a life within the larger rhythms of the community. In ancient Rome, The birthdays of men were occasionally marked in the households of the wealthy, while those of women and children were largely passed over in silence. Even among the elite, the celebration was modest and irregular. Nothing like the annual fixed point we now build into the structure of every year. Deeper in the past, in the small hunter-gatherer communities that preceded settled civilization, the question of how old someone was in years simply never arose. People moved through recognizable stages of life: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age. And those stages were marked by physical changes, by ritual, and by the tasks a person could take on. A child became an adolescent when their body showed it. An adolescent became an adult when they could carry the responsibilities of one. The transition was social and visible, witnessed and confirmed by the people around them. Anthropologists who have studied such communities in Australia, in sub-Saharan Africa, and across the Amazon basin describe a world where age as a number is genuinely meaningless, but where position in the life cycle is tracked with great care and social precision. The community knew where each person stood, not in years, but in relation to the stages of life that everyone moved through. That knowledge was enough to organize labor, to distribute resources, to determine who could marry and who could lead and who needed to be cared for. This system worked, and it worked well, for thousands upon thousands of years. It only begins to show its limits when society grows large enough that strangers must make decisions about one another. When a state needs to levy taxes, conscript soldiers, or administer inheritance law across thousands of people, it will never meet in person. At that point, the informal, visible, community-based understanding of where someone is in life is no longer sufficient. A number is needed. But producing reliable numbers for entire populations requires an infrastructure that takes centuries to build. And in the meantime, the world gets along without them in ways that are both inventive and, by our standards, deeply imprecise. It is worth holding on to that image as we move forward through this story. Millions of people living full and ordered lives, going about their days with no fixed idea of the year in which they were born, and finding that, most of the time, it did not matter at all. Rome and the art of guessing. Imagine the most organized empire in the ancient world. Roads stretching across continents, armies moving with military precision, tax collectors reaching into every corner of every province, and almost none of them knew how old they were. That is the paradox of Rome. The Romans had the census. Every 5 years, officials traveled across the empire registering every citizen, their name, their household, their property, their age. It was one of the most ambitious administrative projects the ancient world had ever seen. And when historians started actually reading those census records, they found something that stopped them cold. Almost half of all Romans over 25 reported an age ending in 0 or 5, 30, 40, 50, 60, not 32, not 47, not 53, always the round number. Always the comfortable guess. The chance of that happening by accident is essentially 0. What it tells us is that when a Roman official knocked on the door and asked, "How old are you?" most people simply made something up. They reached for the nearest round number that felt about right, and the official wrote it down as fact. Demographers now call this pattern age heaping, and the Roman census records are among the most striking examples of it anywhere in the historical record. And here is the part that really stays with you. This was not just the poor or the uneducated. Historians found the exact same pattern on Roman gravestones. Expensive, carefully carved stone memorials paid for by wealthy families who had every reason to get the details right. Even in death, commemorated in stone, the Romans were still rounding. The concentration of ages on multiples of 5 appears on gravestones from Rome itself, from the provinces of North Africa, from the distant corners of Britannia. It was not a regional habit. It was a universal one. The empire that built the Colosseum, the aqueducts, and 15,000 miles of paved road was running its entire legal and military system on ages that were, to a large degree, invented. The Roman state had established clear legal ages for everything that mattered. Boys reached formal adulthood at around 14, when they put on the toga of manhood and entered civic life. Military service came with its own age requirements. Too young, and you were turned away. Too old, and you were exempt. Property rights, inheritance, tax categories, all of it attached to specific age thresholds. The law was precise. The population it governed was not. So when documentation failed entirely, which was most of the time, Rome fell back on the body. A physician or military assessor would examine a young man's teeth, observe the development of his muscles, assess the condition of his skin and beard. The method had a long pedigree. The Greeks had refined dental examination as a way of estimating the age of horses. It was standard practice at any livestock market, the kind of skill passed down through generations of farmers and traders. When the same need arose for human beings, the same knowledge was applied with only modest adaptation. There is something almost matter-of-fact about how the Romans handled this. The gap between the law's precision and the population's actual knowledge was simply a feature of the world, not a problem to be solved. Officials recorded what they were told. Physicians assessed what they could see. The empire kept functioning. What it did not do, for all its administrative sophistication, was actually know how old its own people were. That particular problem would take many more centuries and an entirely different kind of state to even partially resolve. The Middle Ages and the season of your birth. Here is something that sounds like it belongs in a novel, but comes straight from real court records. A man stands before a judge in medieval England. He needs to prove he is old enough to inherit land. The legal threshold is 21 years. He has no document, no baptism record, no written evidence of any kind. So witnesses are called, and one of them testifies, "I know he is old enough because I remember the year he was born. There was a great flood that year." A flood, accepted as legal proof of age, written into the court record, used to decide who would inherit the land. This was not unusual. This was the ordinary mechanism of medieval law. And it tells you something essential about how that world actually worked. After the collapse of Rome, the administrative systems that had at least attempted to track populations simply dissolved. What replaced them was entirely local. The parish priest, the village elder, the shared memory of a community that had known each other for generations. There were no municipal offices, no civil registers, no documents that traveled with a person through their life. What existed was the church, and the church baptized children, and sometimes recorded those baptisms. But the baptism date was not the birth date, and the record was not guaranteed to survive. Priests served multiple villages spread across difficult terrain. A winter birth might mean the child was brought to the font weeks later when the roads thawed. In some communities, baptism was delayed until the infant seemed likely to survive. Infant mortality being what it was, the gap between the day of birth and the day of baptism could be substantial, and the record itself was fragile. Parish books were kept in churches, and churches burned. They were kept in damp stone buildings, and ink fades. When a family moved to another parish, which people did, even in the Middle Ages, the records of the previous community stayed behind, or were lost, or had never been kept at all. The systematic maintenance of parish registers only became compulsory across Catholic Europe after the Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563. That decision, that every parish must consistently record baptisms, marriages, and burials, was transformative, but it lay centuries in the future for the people of the High and Early Middle Ages. In the meantime, people oriented themselves in time through the saints' calendar. The year was structured by feast days that everyone knew and observed: St. Martin in November, St. John in June, the Annunciation in March, Christmas, Easter. These were the fixed points of the calendar, as familiar as the seasons themselves. A child born around the feast of St. John carried that association through life, not as a formal birth date, but as the nearest landmark available. In the legal records that survive from medieval England, France, and the German territories, this imprecision is treated as entirely ordinary. Witnesses described people not by age, but by impression. A man of mature years, perhaps past 30, certainly not yet 50. Those impressions, sworn under oath by people who had known the individual for decades, were considered adequate for legal purposes. When a more precise determination was needed, when the exact threshold of 21 really mattered, the court gathered whatever evidence existed: the memory of a flood, the recollection of a hard winter, the testimony of a midwife if she still lived. It was imprecise, it was sometimes wrong, and it held medieval society together in its imperfect way for centuries. China and the 12 animals. There is a documented case from Imperial China of a man who appeared before a court and stated his age. The judge looked at him carefully, looked at his face, his posture, the lines around his eyes, and told him he was 12 years older than he thought, not 2 years off, not 5, 12, an entire cycle of the zodiac silently miscounted. And the man standing before the court had genuinely no idea. This kind of story was not a curiosity. It was a known and recurring feature of everyday life in one of the most administratively sophisticated empires in human history. The Chinese imperial state had built, over centuries, an extraordinary bureaucratic apparatus. Tax registers, military rosters, land surveys, judicial archives. The infrastructure of governance reached deep into daily life across a population that at various points numbered in the hundreds of millions. If any civilization should have been able to track the ages of its people, it was this one. And yet, the ordinary farmer, the village craftsman, the soldier moving through this vast system, typically had only a loose sense of how many years they had lived, not because they were careless or uneducated, but because the system they used to track time made precise personal age genuinely difficult to establish. Most people knew their birth year not as an absolute number, but as an animal in the zodiac cycle: rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, pig, and then rat again. The cycle repeated every 12 years. Knowing your animal told you your birth year in one sense, but only your position within the cycle, not which cycle. A person born in the year of the rat and a person born 12 or 24 years earlier shared exactly the same answer. Without additional context, a memorable event, a dynasty transition, a war. Distinguishing between those possibilities could be genuinely impossible. Cases of 12-year errors appear in court records and census registers across multiple dynasties. The error was discovered when officials noticed that the person's physical appearance was incompatible with the age they had given, or when a family member with clearer memory stepped forward to correct the record. Sometimes the person themselves did not dispute the correction. They had simply not known. Layered on top of the zodiac confusion was the Sui system of age counting. Under Sui, a person was 1 year old from the moment of birth, not from some future birthday. And at the start of each new lunar year, every person in the country gained a year simultaneously, regardless of when they had actually been born. A child arriving in the final weeks of the year would, within days, officially become 2 years old. The Sui age and what we would call the biological age differed by 1 or 2 years, and both measures circulated in everyday use without any clear agreement about which one applied in a given situation. On top of all this sat the imperial calendar, which counted years not in any continuous sequence, but within the reign period of the current emperor. Year 5 of one era, year 17 of another. Converting those designations into anything absolute required knowing the complete sequence of imperial reigns and their lengths, knowledge that the educated official class possessed, but that the vast majority of the population simply did not. The result was that a person living in Imperial China might simultaneously be uncertain about which zodiac cycle they belong to, unsure of the difference between their Sui age and their biological age, and entirely unable to translate their birth year into any reference frame that a stranger from a different province would recognize. South Korea maintained a version of the Sui system all the way to 2023, when it was officially abolished after years of public debate about the confusion it created in legal, medical, and administrative contexts. On the day the law changed, millions of Koreans became 1 or 2 years younger overnight. It made headlines, people celebrated, and it was a reminder that the ways a society counts a human life are not fixed by nature. They are choices, and choices can be changed. Slavery and the Stolen Age. Everything we have looked at so far has one thing in common. The uncertainty about age was passive. Nobody knew ages because nobody had built the systems to track them properly. It was a gap, a consequence of limited infrastructure, imperfect record keeping, the simple difficulty of organizing information about millions of people across vast territories. What comes next is different. In the history of slavery, not knowing your own age was not an accident. It was not a gap. It was something done to you, deliberately, systematically, as a method of control. Across the transatlantic slave trade that shaped the modern Americas, and in the systems of slavery that existed in the Ottoman Empire, in ancient Rome, and across the Arab world, the destruction of personal identity was not an incidental feature of the institution. It was foundational to it. Names were changed at the point of enslavement. Families were separated through sale and relocation. Languages were suppressed. The entire texture of a person's history, who their parents were, where they came from, what their name had been before, when they had been born, was stripped away as part of the process of converting a person into property. Among the things consistently withheld was knowledge of one's own age. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in Maryland in 1838 and went on to become one of the most important writers and speakers of the 19th century, described this with striking directness in his 1845 autobiography. He wrote that he had no knowledge of his own age, not approximately, not even in rough terms. The information had been actively kept from him, as it was kept from most enslaved people. He observed that slaveholders considered it improper for an enslaved person to know the facts of their own life. The withholding was deliberate. To not know when you were born was to be cut off from the most basic coordinate of your own existence, to live without a past you could fully claim as your own. Douglas later established, through careful research after gaining his freedom, that he had probably been born in 1818. He did not know this as a young man. His enslaver may well have known. It did not matter. The information was not shared, because sharing it served no purpose that the institution recognized. When enslaved people were sold, which happened repeatedly, not just once, their age was assigned by whoever was conducting the transaction. The inspection was systematic and without ceremony. The mouth was opened, the teeth examined, muscle development, posture, the condition of the skin. All of it noted and evaluated. An age was estimated. That age determined the price. A younger person was worth more, an older one less. The figure was written into the bill of sale as fact, with the same confidence as a description of height or weight. Auction records and estate inventories from the American South describe individuals as male, presumed 25 years, or woman of about 30. The word presumed carries enormous weight in those documents. It is the point where the fiction becomes briefly visible, where the absence of any real record shows through the surface of the paperwork before the transaction closes over it again. After emancipation, the consequences of this erasure did not simply end. Millions of people entered legal freedom with no documents of any kind, no proof of birth, no recorded age, nothing written down that predated the moment of liberation. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865 to help formerly enslaved people navigate the transition, quickly found that the absence of documentation created obstacles at every turn. Claiming land, enrolling children in school, establishing a legal marriage, accessing government support, all required paperwork that had never been created. Witnesses were found, affidavits were written, approximations were accepted, but the gap was wide, and in various forms it persisted across generations. The state demands a birth date. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The country you live in almost certainly made birth registration compulsory at some point in the last 200 years. Not 2,000 years ago, not 500, 200 or less. England made it law in 1836, France in 1792. The United States did not have a functioning national system until well into the 20th century. In large parts of the world, reliable universal registration only arrived after the Second World War, meaning that grandparents and great-grandparents of people alive today may have spent significant parts of their lives without a single document proving when they were born. The push toward registration did not come from any noble concern for individual identity or the rights of ordinary people. It came from governments that needed information and didn't have it. Through the 17th and into the 18th century, European states were becoming more complex and more expensive. Wars lasted longer and cost more. Territories grew larger. Tax systems became more sophisticated. All of this required information about populations, how many people there were, where they lived, how old they were, and on the question of age specifically, the information available was deeply unreliable. You cannot conscript soldiers by birth year if nobody reliably knows what year they were born. You cannot set an inheritance threshold at 21 if age is systematically unknown. You cannot build a pension system, a school enrollment system, or a legal framework around age if the underlying data simply does not exist. The administrative machinery that modern states depend on requires age as an input, and for centuries, that input was missing. The solution, adopted gradually across Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries, was compulsory civil registration. France moved early, driven by the Revolution of 1789 and its vision of a centralized state built around equal, identifiable citizens. England followed with the Civil Registration Act of 1836. Similar legislation spread across Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and the rest of Europe across the following decades. But passing a law and enforcing it are entirely different things. In England, in the years immediately after 1836, large numbers of births went unregistered. Rural families in remote areas had little contact with civil authorities and little reason to make the trip to a registrar's office. Some distrusted the government. Many simply did not see the point. The record shows that compliance was slow and uneven for decades after the law was passed. The state's response was systematic. It made the birth certificate progressively more necessary for everyday life. No certificate, no enrollment in state schools when compulsory education arrived in the 1870s. No certificate, no legally registered marriage. Later, no passport, no government benefit, no bank account. Step by step, the document became the key that unlocked participation in modern society. Those without it found themselves locked out of systems they had previously moved through without thinking. Colonial powers carried versions of this system to their empires, but applied them in ways that reflected administrative convenience, rather than any concern for the populations involved. In India, British registration covered the urban populations already in contact with colonial administration, while vast rural areas remained unrecorded. In Africa, officials at colonial registration posts looked at the people before them and made guesses, estimated 20 to 25 years. Those guesses were stamped and filed and became official records. The foundation of documented lives built on nothing more solid than a stranger's approximation. What people invented when they had to choose. When someone without a birth certificate was placed before an official and asked for their age, they did what people have always done when pressed for a number they cannot produce with confidence. They made something up, and those inventions, gathered across millions of census records, court documents, and official registers spanning centuries and every inhabited continent, follow patterns so consistent that statisticians can use them today as a diagnostic tool, a way of measuring how unreliable a historical dataset actually is. The patterns do not vary much by culture or era. They vary by the degree of uncertainty the people being recorded were experiencing. And that makes them a kind of accidental record, not of what ages people were, but of how little they knew. The most universal pattern is the pull toward round numbers. When people estimated their age without a solid basis for that estimate, they reached instinctively for multiples of 5, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. The numbers feel complete and trustworthy in a way that 33 or 47 simply does not. This shows up in Roman census papyri from Egypt. It shows up in 19th century American census data taken just as formal registration was becoming compulsory. It shows up in British colonial records from India, West Africa, the Caribbean, and Australia. The pattern is so consistent across such different times and places that it reflects something not about any particular culture, but about the human mind itself. About what happens when you need a number you don't have and must produce one anyway. Statisticians call this digit preference, and they use it as a measure of data quality. The more pronounced the clustering around round numbers in a dataset, the less reliable the age data in that dataset is. Some historical census records are so heavily weighted toward multiples of 5 that historians treat the age columns as almost meaningless, useful for rough demographic patterns, useless for anything precise. Beyond the simple preference for round numbers, people also adjusted their stated ages in response to the specific incentives of their situation. Age was not a neutral fact. It had consequences. For taxes, for military service, for legal rights and obligations. And people with no precise knowledge of the correct figure had both the freedom and the reason to choose one that helped them. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, researchers examining tax records found a statistical excess of men claiming to be in their 60s, the age at which certain tax obligations were reduced or eliminated. The clustering is far too pronounced to be coincidental. In military registers across Europe, the pressure ran in the opposite direction. Men wanted to appear either too young or too old for conscription, and the ages they gave reflect exactly those thresholds. The sweet spot, the age range where service was mandatory, is consistently underrepresented in military records from conscription-era Europe. People were navigating the system with the only tool they had, which was the freedom to say whatever number seemed most useful. There are court records from early modern England in which witnesses confirmed their own age under oath and added, without any apparent embarrassment, that they had never been entirely certain of the year. The admission was noted. The estimate was recorded as fact. The proceeding moved forward. And then, there is perhaps the strangest detail of all. In countries where birth registration arrived relatively late, demographers studying the data have consistently found one particular date massively overrepresented as a stated birthday, the 1st of January. Not because that is when those people were actually born, but because when someone who had never had an official birth date was finally required to provide one, they needed to choose something. And the most neutral, most obvious, most universally available placeholder, the date that sits at the beginning of everything, the reset point of the year, is January the 1st. Tens of millions of people around the world officially share that birthday. Most of them have no idea when they were actually born. They simply picked the beginning. The teeth as evidence. There is something quietly strange about the fact that for most of human history, the most reliable way to establish a person's age was to look in their mouth, not a document, not a record, not a number written in a book somewhere. A mouth. And yet that is exactly what happened. In courtrooms, in military recruitment posts, in slave markets, and in modern immigration offices. Across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. When paperwork failed, people turned to the body, and the body, it turns out, keeps a kind of record of its own. Teeth age in predictable and well-documented ways. In childhood, the sequence is fairly precise. Milk teeth are lost and replaced by permanent teeth in a recognizable pattern that unfolds over roughly a decade. The wisdom teeth arrive in the late teenage years, though with considerable individual variation. After that, wear patterns accumulate. The biting surfaces of the teeth erode slowly with use. The gum line recedes. The enamel yellows and dulls. None of these changes are precise clocks, but together they form a readable timeline, rough but usable, and entirely independent of any written record. This knowledge was not specialized medical expertise. It was the kind of practical wisdom that anyone working with animals already possessed. Livestock farmers in the ancient world, assessed the age of horses and oxen from their teeth as a matter of routine. It was how you avoided being deceived at market, how you knew whether you were buying a young animal or an old one. The skill was passed down through generations of farmers and traders, refined through long experience and widely understood. When the same need arose for assessing the age of human beings, the transfer of that knowledge was direct and largely unremarkable. In the slave markets of Rome, of Carthage, and later of the early modern Atlantic world, buyers opened the mouths of the people they were inspecting and drew their conclusions. The practice was embedded in the commercial logic of the transaction. Age affected price, and price required assessment, and assessment meant looking at the teeth. Nobody involved seems to have considered it unusual. It was simply how things worked. In military recruitment across Europe, dental and physical inspection served a parallel function. The Roman army used it. Medieval military assessors used it. And when the scale of European warfare expanded dramatically in the Napoleonic era, formal military medical examination became standard practice across the major armies of the continent. Assessment records from that period, which survive in considerable numbers in French and British archives, describe recruits not by birth year, but by physical and dental age, appearing to be between 18 and 22. Based on the condition of the teeth and the development of the jaw and musculature. That estimate determined whether the man was accepted into service, deferred, or sent home. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, medicine added new dimensions to the practice. The growth plates, areas of cartilage near the ends of the long bones in the limbs, close at fairly predictable points during adolescence and early adulthood. Examining their state of development gives a developmental age range that is entirely independent of any document. With the arrival of X-ray technology in the early 20th century, this examination became non-invasive and considerably more systematic. Imaging the bones of the wrist or knee could place a young person within a range corresponding to several years of development, and the method was quickly adopted wherever age was legally consequential and documents were absent. It remains in use today, most visibly in immigration and asylum proceedings in various countries, where individuals arrive without documents and their legal status depends on whether they are classified as children or adults. The X-ray provides a range, typically 2 to 4 years wide, and that range is used to make binding determinations with significant consequences. A minor receives legal protection, a guardian, different treatment within the system. An adult does not, decided in the end by the same basic logic that a Roman livestock trader would have recognized immediately. Look at the body, make your best judgment, move on. Still today. In 2019, UNICEF published a number worth sitting with. More than 166 million children under the age of 5 had never been officially registered. Not in the ancient world, not in medieval Europe. In 2019, 166 million children, a figure close to the entire population of Russia, who existed in every real and human sense, but did not exist on paper. No birth certificate, no official record of their arrival, no entry in any register that any state would recognize as proof that they had been born. Those children are growing up right now. They are going to school, or trying to. They are working, or being made to work. They are moving toward adulthood, carrying the same invisible gap that people across all the centuries of this story have carried. The gap between existing as a person and existing as a documented one. And at some point, they will encounter the wall that this gap eventually produces. A school that requires a certificate for enrollment. An employer who needs a document. A border crossing, a bank, a government office, a marriage registration. All of them built around the assumption that the person in front of them can prove when they were born. Your date of birth, please. The regions where registration remains lowest are not random. They are the places where the combination of factors this story has traced comes together most completely. Limited administrative infrastructure that never reached into rural areas. Geographic isolation that makes registration offices genuinely inaccessible. Histories of colonial governance that created documentation systems serving the colonizers rather than the people being administered. And generations of accumulated experience teaching communities that when governments tried to count them, what followed was taxation or conscription or worse. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in areas of South and Southeast Asia, in conflict-affected territories across the Middle East, birth registration rates have historically been very low, in some areas below 10%. The reasons are layered and specific, but the patterns recur. The nearest registration office is a day's travel away across difficult terrain. The registration fee, modest by any external standard, exceeds what a family living at subsistence level can spare. The forms are in a language the parents cannot read. The process requires documentation the family does not have. And underlying all of it, in many communities, is a rational wariness of official systems that have historically delivered consequences rather than services. The effects compound across a lifetime in ways that are difficult to overstate. A child without a birth certificate cannot enroll in state schools in many countries, which means the primary pathway out of poverty closes before they have had a chance to walk through it. Without documentation, a child's legal status as a minor cannot be formally established, which means they are more vulnerable to labor exploitation, to early marriage, to being treated as an adult by systems designed to protect children from exactly those outcomes. The exclusion from financial systems, legal systems, and political participation that follows an undocumented life tends to pass from one generation to the next, compounding with each cycle. Progress has been real and sustained. In 1990, an estimated 40% of births worldwide were officially registered. By 2019, that figure had risen above 75%, a substantial improvement driven by decades of effort. From organizations like UNICEF and Save the Children, by governments that have simplified procedures and reduced costs, and by mobile registration programs that have brought the process to communities that formal offices never reached. But 75% still means 1 in 4, and the children in that quarter are overwhelmingly concentrated in the places where every obstacle in this story intersects at once. What this story has traced, from the earliest human communities to the present, is the slow and uneven construction of something that most of us now treat as obvious. The idea that the moment of your birth deserves to be written down, that you exist not only in the memory of the people who love you, but in the record of the society you are part of, that your age, that simple, basic fact, is something the world should know and protect. That idea is newer than we think. It is not yet universal, and the distance between having it and not having it continues to shape lives today in ways that are just as real as anything in the centuries this story has passed through.